Top 1. The Vulture Stone. The year is 9600 BCE. You are standing on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, and the world is still recovering from something catastrophic. The ice is retreating, the megafauna are dying, and a group of people who have no metal tools, no written language, and no wheel are dragging 20-ton limestone pillars up a ridge and carving a message into them that they intend to last forever. They are not carving a hunt. They are not carving a king. They are carving the night the sky fell. This is Göbekli Tepe. It was first noticed by a Western researcher in 1963 and dismissed as a medieval cemetery. It took Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute excavating seriously from 1994 onward to understand what he was actually looking at: a monumental ritual complex, circular enclosures of T-shaped pillars, each between 10 and 20 tons, decorated with animals, carved with extraordinary precision. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000. And it was built, according to every piece of evidence we have, by hunter-gatherers who were not supposed to be capable of building anything like it. Among the pillars, one stands apart. Pillar 43, researchers call it the Vulture Stone, and what is carved on it is either a piece of religious imagery or one of the most precise astronomical records ever created by human hands. Possibly both. The carving shows a vulture holding what appears to be a sphere or disc. Beside it, a headless human figure. Below, a scorpion, a crane, a fox, and a sequence of other animals arranged in specific positions relative to one another. For decades, these were interpreted as shamanic symbols, animals associated with death and the soul's journey to the underworld. A reasonable reading given the context. Then in 2017, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis at the University of Edinburgh published an analysis in Mediterranean archaeology and archaeometry. Their argument was specific and peer-reviewed. The animals on Pillar 43, they claimed, are not random religious imagery. They correspond to constellations: Sagittarius, Scorpius, others. And when you overlay those constellation positions on the night sky and ask what date they encode, the answer points to approximately 10,150 BCE, a date that means something. That date falls within a narrow window associated with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a proposed event still debated among geologists and atmospheric scientists, in which a comet or asteroid airburst struck the Earth and triggered 1,200 years of sudden global cooling. Temperatures plummeted within decades. The mammoths disappeared. The megafauna vanished. The entire ecological world that Paleolithic humans had navigated for tens of thousands of years collapsed almost overnight. If that event happened, and a growing body of evidence in the geological record suggests something dramatic did, then the people who built Göbekli Tepe may have been its survivors, and Pillar 43 may be their memorial. The sphere the vulture holds in Sweatman's reading represents the sun positioned at the summer solstice on that specific date, a position that would require systematic sky observation across generations to identify and record. The headless figure below may not be a shaman. It may be the dead. It may be all of them. The site was deliberately buried around 8,000 BCE, not by invaders, not by erosion. It was methodically backfilled with animal bones, stone tools, and debris, as if someone decided it needed to be sealed and preserved. The complex covers at least 90,000 square meters. Fewer than 5% of it has been excavated. Mainstream archaeologists are careful here. They accept the complexity of the site. They accept that the astronomical correspondences are real enough to publish. What they resist is the leap from correlation to intent. Random overlapping of symbols and constellations, they argue, will always produce apparent alignments if you look hard enough. But here is what they cannot fully explain. Why bury it? Why seal the most sophisticated structure hunter-gatherers had ever built and walk away from it, leaving no explanation, no successor site, no cultural continuation we can trace? What were they locking inside? And what were they afraid of letting out? Top 2, the goggle-eyed gods. Half a world away, on an island in the Pacific, a different culture was pulling something out of clay that raises an almost identical question. The goggle-eyed gods, Japan, 1,000 years before the Common Era. No metallurgy, no writing system, no contact with any civilization beyond the surrounding sea. And yet the objects the Jomon people are pulling from their fires look less like religious idols and more like engineering blueprints for something that had not yet been invented. They are called dog, clay figurines, hand-built, fired in the open air, and found in ceremonial contexts across the Japanese archipelago, from the northern island of Hokkaido all the way south through Honshu. More than 18,000 specimens have been excavated. Most are fragmentary, most are strange, but one category among them is in a class of its own, and it is the category that stops people cold the first time they encounter it: the goggle-eyed dog. The most famous example was found in 1887 at the Kamagaoka archaeological site in Aomori Prefecture. It stands 34 cm tall. It weighs 2.14 kilograms. It is made of fired clay and has been held in the Tokyo National Museum since its discovery. The Japanese government designated it a national treasure in 1997. It is one of the most carefully studied prehistoric objects in Asia, and it looks, depending on your frame of reference, either like a fertility idol or like a figure in a pressurized suit. The eyes are the first thing you notice: enormous, hollow, segmented into lens-like panels. They wrap around the upper half of the face in a way that no natural eye has ever done, and every flight helmet does. The head sits inside what appears to be a structured covering, sealed at the collar. The body is covered, every centimeter of it, in geometric rectangular paneling. Not spirals, not organic curves. Rectangles, arranged in lines that run precisely along the shoulders, down the arms, across the torso, stopping at the wrists and neck, exactly where the seams of a sealed suit would stop. Japanese archaeologist Taro Obayashi documented that dog figurines have no morphological parallel in any contemporary hunter-gatherer culture in Korea, China, Siberia, or across the Pacific. The goggle-eyed form does not evolve gradually from simpler Jomon figurines. It appears fully formed and then persists for centuries without significant variation, as if the carvers were not inventing a style, but copying a model that stayed consistent because the model itself was not changing. The surrounding surface patterning is not decorative in the way Jomon pottery decoration is decorative. Pottery decoration on this culture's ceramics is fluid, flame-like, expressive. The dog body paneling is structural, rigid. It maps onto joint locations, the shoulders, the elbows, the hips. These are exactly the points where a modern high-altitude pressure suit requires articulated panels to allow movement while maintaining internal pressure. The hollowness of the eyes suggests they were designed to be illuminated from behind, placed before a fire so the face would glow. Whatever these figures represented, they were meant to be seen as alive. What makes the dog ritual context even stranger is the deliberate fragmentation. Every dog that has been found has been broken, consistently, intentionally, before being deposited. The arm in one location, the torso in another. Sometimes pieces of a single figurine turn up at sites hundreds of kilometers apart. Archaeologists call this practice the ritual killing of the figurine, but the distribution of pieces suggests something more like deliberate dispersal, as if the figure's power had to be divided and contained. No dog has ever been found in a domestic context, not near a hearth, not in a storage pit. Every confirmed example comes from a ceremonial deposit, a liminal site near water, or a deliberate burial. Whatever the Jomon were doing with them, it was not decoration, it was theology. The mainstream reading is straightforward. Dogu represent fertility spirits or shamanic intermediaries. The large eyes indicate supernatural perception. The body markings reflect ritual tattooing or scarification. The fragmentation transfers spiritual power to whoever holds the piece. These are reasonable interpretations grounded in comparative anthropology, but the mainstream reading does not explain the goggle geometry. Ritual eyes in other prehistoric traditions across Africa, Europe, and the Americas are round or staring or multiple. They do not divide into segmented panels. They do not wrap the face like a visor. And fertility goddesses in every other prehistoric tradition on Earth are defined by exaggerated human anatomy. The dog are defined by the absence of human anatomy, replaced by something structured, sealed, and segmented. What were the Jomon people looking at? What did they see or encounter or remember from a time before them that they reproduced in fired clay with such specific and stubborn precision? Top 3, the Great Martian God, and why on the other side of the planet, in a Saharan desert that was not yet a desert, were people painting something onto rock walls that raises exactly the same question? The Great Martian God. 6,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. Rivers ran through it. Lakes gathered at its edges. Cattle grazed across plains that are now sand. The people who lived there were skilled, careful observers of the world around them, and they recorded everything they saw on the walls of the Tassili Niger Plateau in southeastern Algeria, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that holds more than 15,000 individual rock art images. They painted their cattle with anatomical precision. They painted hunters and dancers and families and the animals of a living landscape. They were not primitive. They were thorough, and then, scattered through that record of a living world, they painted something else entirely. French explorer Henri Lotte led the first major expedition to Tassili Niger between 1956 and 1957. He cataloged over 800 images. He was an experienced archaeologist. He had seen rock art across the world, and when he encountered a particular series of figures, he named the largest of them the Great Martian God. Not as a joke, not as a metaphor. He couldn't think of another name. The Great Martian God stands approximately 6 miles tall. It required scaffolding or cooperative effort by multiple painters working at height to produce. It shows a figure with a perfectly round, featureless head inside what appears to be a sealed oval covering. The body wears a one-piece suit with no visible seam at the neck. Lines extend from the head in a radiating pattern like an aureole or the elements of a helmet ring. There is no mouth. There is no nose. There are large, forward-facing eyes inside the oval head covering. Across the plateau, at least 30 distinct figures of this type have been cataloged, painted by different hands at different sites over a period that stratigraphic analysis suggests spanned approximately 2,000 years. They are not all identical, but they share the same core configuration with a consistency that is difficult to explain as independent, artistic invention. What makes them visually jarring is the contrast. Every other figure in the same panels, the humans, the cattle, the hunters, is painted with clear and specific anatomy: eyes, mouths, muscle lines, postures. The rock art tradition at Tassili is not crude. It is detailed and confident, which means the artists who produced the round-headed figures were not failing to paint human features. They were choosing not to. Emmanuel Anati, an archaeologist at the University of Rome who spent more than 40 years studying Saharan rock art, confirmed that the round-headed style appears in a distinct cultural layer corresponding to a period of rapid climate transition in the region, approximately 6,000 to 5,500 BCE, when the Green Sahara was beginning its shift toward aridity. Something changed, and in that period of change, a series of figures appeared in the record that have no parallel in the artistic tradition before or after them. The mainstream interpretation is shamanic. These are spirit beings or humans in trance states, their faces deliberately obscured to indicate an altered or supernatural condition. The floating posture reflects the sensation of weightlessness reported in deep dissociative experience. The radiating lines are power or light. The sealed body covering is a ritual costume. It is a coherent explanation rooted in comparative shamanic anthropology. But trance state figures in other traditions, Southern African sand rock art, Siberian shamanic petroglyphs, Amazonian ceremonial imagery, show the distortion of known human forms. Limbs multiply, bodies dissolve, features blur. They show a human coming apart. The Tassili figures are not distorted humans. They are sealed, structured, contained. They have defined edges and deliberate forms. They look less like a human losing their shape and more like something that was never human to begin with. And then there is the distribution problem. Similar round-headed, featureless figures wearing apparent suits and head coverings have since been documented at rock art sites in the Kimberley region of Australia, at Val Camonica in northern Italy, and at sites in central India. These are cultures that had no contact with each other and no shared artistic tradition. The geographical spread of an identical visual form across isolated continents over thousands of years is not something the shamanic explanation accounts for. What if the Saharan artists were doing what artists always do, recording what they saw? And what if what they saw 6,000 years ago in a green Sahara that was beginning to die was also what the Jomon people saw in Japan. Top 4. The Astronaut King. From the open walls of Algeria, we descend into stone, into a burial chamber in Mexico sealed for 1,200 years, where a king was laid to rest beneath a carving that aerospace engineers have looked at and described, independently and without context, in terms that were never meant to describe ancient art. The Astronaut King. In 683 CE, the most powerful ruler the Maya city of Palenque had ever known was sealed inside his pyramid. His name was Kinich Janab Pakal. He had ruled for 68 years, and the stone placed over his body was not just a lid, it was a statement. 3.8 mm long, 2.22 mm wide, carved with an image so complex and so specific that scholars have spent over 7 decades arguing about what it means. Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruiz Luillier found the hidden staircase in 1948, noticing that one of the floor stones in the Temple of the Inscriptions had finger holes drilled into it. He spent 4 years clearing the rubble that had been deliberately packed into the passage. He entered the burial chamber in 1952. What he found inside was the most elaborate Mayan tomb ever discovered, and above the body of Pakal, the lid. The image on that lid shows a central human figure in a specific, deliberate posture. The figure reclines at an angle of roughly 40 degrees, spine arched, knees bent, head tilted back. Both hands are occupied. One appears to grip an object. The other is positioned near what looks like a control surface. At the base of the composition, a downward-pointing element opens in what some read as a flared exhaust. At the top, a cross-shaped form rises, which Mayan scholars identify as the world tree, the cosmic axis connecting the underworld to the heavens. The figure sits precisely at the intersection between death and ascent. Mayan epigrapher Linda Shelley and archaeologist David Friedel decoded the surrounding iconography definitively in A Forest of Kings, published in 1990. Their reading is thorough and well-supported. The world tree at the top, the jaws of the earth, monster at the base consuming Pakal as he descends into Xibalba, the underworld. The quadripartite badge, a sun symbol at the figure's nose. Every element maps onto documented Mayan cosmological symbolism found in dozens of other funerary contexts across the Maya world. Within the framework of Mayan religion, the image makes complete sense. What it also does, and this is the part that will not go away, is look exactly like a man operating a machine. The reclining angle of the figure corresponds almost precisely to the posture NASA biomechanical studies identified in the 1960s as optimal for human survival under high-acceleration launch forces. You do not sit upright in a rocket at launch. You recline. Your spine takes the force as compression rather than shear. The posture on Pakal's lid is not the posture of a man descending peacefully into water, which is how the underworld journey is depicted on every other Mayan funerary monument. It is the posture of a man being pushed backward by acceleration. The lid weighs approximately 5 tons. It was lowered into the burial chamber before the pyramid was built around it. The chamber is accessible only through a narrow staircase the lid could never fit through. Whatever is carved on that stone was placed where no one would ever see it again. That is not how you display religious iconography. That is how you seal something important. Shelley's decipherment is accepted consensus, and it should be taken seriously. Every symbol she identified is documented elsewhere in the Mayan world. The world tree is real. Xibalba is real. The death and resurrection narrative is real. The question is not whether those symbols are present. They are. The question is why, of all the ways to depict a king descending into the underworld, the most powerful artist at the most important funerary moment in Palenque's history chose a composition that requires an aerospace engineer to explain away. 5 other Mayan sarcophagus lids from the same period survive. None shows this configuration. Pakal's is unique. If the composition is purely symbolic and the posture is incidental, the uniqueness is unexplained. If it is intentional, the intent is unexplained. Either way, something about this carving resists closure. Top 5, the Electric Temple. And the questions it leaves open echo through the next entry on this list, where a different set of Egyptian artists, working in an underground crypt lit by no torch anyone has ever found evidence of, carved images onto walls that an electrical engineer looked at in 1966 and then went home and built. The Electric Temple. Walk into the underground crypts of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, 60 kilometers north of Luxor in Upper Egypt, and you will find something the tour guides tend to move past quickly. Carved into the walls of these sealed windowless rooms are a series of images that have no agreed-upon explanation. Not because archaeologists haven't tried to explain them, but because the two most compelling explanations come from completely different fields of knowledge, and they cannot both be right. The Temple of Hathor at Dendra is one of the best preserved temple complexes in Egypt. Its construction spans centuries, with the main structure dating to the Ptolemaic period around 50 BCE, though the site itself was sacred for thousands of years before that. The outer walls carry the standard monumental reliefs, gods and pharaohs offering scenes, cosmological diagrams, normal Egyptian sacred art. The underground crypts are different. They are small and closed, carved from solid stone, and according to the temple's own inscriptions, used to store sacred objects between ritual appearances. No windows, no torch brackets, no lamp niches, no trace of soot on the ceilings, which in any Egyptian space lit by open flame is almost impossible to avoid over centuries of use. How the craftsmen who carved these rooms with such precision could see what they were doing is a question Egyptologists acknowledge without resolving. What they carved on the walls of those crypts includes, among other things, 3 panels that have generated more debate than almost any other image in alternative archaeology. Each panel shows a large, elongated, bulb-like form. The bulb stands on a pedestal made of a lotus flower. Inside the bulb, a serpent-shaped figure extends the full length of the interior in a specific S-curve, its body filling the space like a filament. Connected to the base of the lotus pedestal by what appears to be a cable or arm is a Djed pillar, one of the most common symbols in Egyptian religion, officially representing the spine of Osiris in the concept of stability. In 1966, Austrian electrical engineer Walter Garn examined the Dendera panels and built a replica based on their proportions. Using materials available to ancient Egyptians, a glass vessel, an electrolyte solution, and a conductive element, his replica reportedly produced visible arc light, with the illuminated filament shape positioned precisely where the serpent appears inside the carved bulb. The Djed pillar, in his reading, functions as a structural insulator, a form independently invented in the 20th century for high-voltage transmission lines, which happens to be exactly the shape the Djed takes in these specific crypt panels, and notably, only these panels. The mainstream Egyptological reading is clear and reasonable. The elongated form is a lotus bud in vertical profile, a standard creation symbol. The serpent inside represents Apep, or the primordial serpent at the dawn of time, emerging from the lotus as the universe begins. The Djed is its standard protective and stabilizing symbol. Taken together, it is a creation myth, the beginning of light in order from primordial darkness, perfectly consistent with Egyptian theological tradition. But here's what that reading does not address. The lotus bud, as depicted in every other context in Egyptian art, is closed, pointed, and narrow. It does not have a figure inside it. The Dendera bulb is open, rounded at the top, and contains a specific internal element, the wavy S-curve serpent, that has no parallel in any other Egyptian serpent depiction. Egyptian serpents are shown straight, coiled, or rearing. The S-curve is the shape of a heated filament under current, and the Djed appears in more than 1,000 other Egyptian contexts. This is the only context in which it appears connected by a physical arm to another object. The rooms where these images are carved were sealed and lightless. If the images are purely symbolic, the symbolism was intended for no human audience. If they are functional, they describe something the people who carved them understood and used. Top 6. The Sky Beings. From a sealed crypt in Egypt, we cross half the planet to an open cliff face in the Australian outback, where the oldest continuous artistic tradition on Earth has been maintaining the same images for longer than agriculture has existed. And the elders who keep those images alive say the figures they depict are still watching. The Sky Beings. The Wandjina do not have mouths. This is not an accident of time or erosion. It is not a stylistic limitation of the artist. The Aboriginal elders of the Kimberley region in northwestern Australia, who have maintained this painting tradition across an unbroken lineage stretching back at least 4,000 years of documented continuous repainting, and possibly far longer, will tell you exactly why the Wandjina have no mouths. If they open them, what came out would be uncontrollable. Rain, floods, disaster. The mouthlessness is structural and theological. It is not incidental. It is the point. British explorer George Gray first documented Wandjina paintings in 1838 in the caves and cliff faces of the Kimberley. His reaction was notable. He was an experienced explorer who had encountered indigenous art across several continents. He refused initially to believe the paintings were made by Aboriginal Australians, not purely out of the colonial prejudice of his era, though that was present, but because the paintings looked like nothing else he had ever seen produced by any culture anywhere. He spent considerable time in his journals trying to identify what civilization might have produced them instead, and could not. Rock art specialist Ian Crawford's 1968 survey documented more than 260 Wandjina sites across the Kimberley, with individual figures ranging from 30 centimeters to over 5 meters in height. They are painted in white with red and black detailing. The head is large and round, dominating the composition. The eyes are enormous, forward-facing, oval, dark, and lidless. There is no mouth. The body, where shown, wears what appears to be a white robe or suit with no visible seam detail. Around the head, evenly spaced radiating lines form a halo or aureole that Aboriginal elders describe as the lightning and the power the Wandjina carry. Uranium-thorium dating of calcium carbonate, deposits overlying some Wandjina pigments, has produced minimum age estimates of between 3,700 and 4,500 years. The oral tradition claims the figures are much older, and the underlying cultural deposits in the Kimberley indicate continuous human habitation going back at least 65,000 years. The Wandjina tradition may be the longest maintained controlled visual tradition in human history. The word controlled matters. Aboriginal law governing Wandjina is specific. Only initiated members of the particular clan whose Wandjina a given image belongs to may repaint it, and they may only repaint it in its original form. The composition cannot be altered. New elements cannot be added. The figure must look, after repainting, exactly as it looked before. Over 4,000 years of documented repainting, not a single example of a Wandjina with a mouth has been found. If the mouthlessness were a casual stylistic choice, variation would accumulate over millennia. It does not. The prohibition is absolute, maintained across uncountable generations, as if the specific configuration is not a stylistic preference, but a specification. The forward-facing, large oval eyes, sealed head covering, white bodysuit, radiating aureole, and absence of a mouth taken together produce an image that outside observers consistently describe in the same terms. Gray in 1838, Eric von Daniken in 1968, journalists and documentary filmmakers in every decade since. The description that comes out is not from ancient mythology. It is from the 20th century's most persistent cultural anxiety about encounters with non-human intelligence. Anthropologists explain the Wandjina as rain and fertility spirits, sky beings who created the landscape and then merged into the rock walls to watch over it. The large eyes are the all-seeing sky. The halo is lightning. The sealed body represents clouds. The mouthlessness is a deliberate theological statement about divine power. These are internally coherent explanations, and they reflect genuine indigenous theology as transmitted by the elders who maintain the tradition. What they do not explain is the cross-cultural correspondence. The same sealed head, large oval forward-facing eyes, radiating aureole, and featureless face appear at the Tassili Najjar Plateau in Algeria, carved 6,000 years ago. They appear on the Dogue figurines of Japan, molded in clay between 1000 and 300 BCE. They appear in rock art at Val Camonica in Italy and at sites in central India. These are cultures with zero documented contact with Australia. Top 7. The Reptile Rulers. From the Australian cliffs, we travel back in time and inward to the river plains of ancient Iraq, where a culture that built civilization's first temples was carving figures into clay for 1,000 years that didn't look quite like anything that should have been walking around in southern Mesopotamia 5,000 years before the Common Era. The reptile rulers. Before Sumer, before the wheel and the written word, and the first city whose name we know, there was a culture that archaeologists call the Ubaid, and they built the temples that Sumer later expanded into ziggurats, established the canal systems that would define Mesopotamian agriculture for millennia, and created the cosmological framework that flowed directly into the gods and myths of the world's first recorded civilization. They were the foundation, the substrate, the thing that Sumer grew on top of. And for at least 1,000 years, they made the same idol over and over at every major site in the same form. And that form was not quite human. Henry Hall first identified the Ubaid culture at Tel el-Ubaid in 1919. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur through the 1920s recovered more examples. Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd's work at Eridu, conducted between 1946 and 1949, revealed the deepest and oldest layers of what the Sumerians themselves identified as the first city ever built on Earth. And at these sites, across hundreds of kilometers and a span of 1,000 years, the same figurines appeared. Elongated skulls, narrow angular faces with slit eyes, pointed snouts, and no rounded human features. Deliberate upright postures indicating authority. Some hold objects, some are shown seated, and some, in one of the most unsettling details in all of prehistoric art, are shown nursing infants. Both the mother and the infant carry the same reptilian morphology. This is not a costume figure. This is not a mask. When you depict a nursing mother and child with identical non-human features, you are depicting a lineage. British archaeologist Joan Oates of Cambridge University provided the most systematic published analysis of Ubaid figurines in her studies from 1960 and 1978. She confirmed the morphological consistency across sites spanning approximately 500 kilometers and documented the figurines' consistent association with the earliest known permanent temple structures. These were not domestic objects. They were found at the foundations of religious buildings, in the places where the most sacred things were kept. What no one has produced is an evolutionary sequence. In every other artistic tradition across the ancient world, styles develop. They start crude and become refined. They start simple and accumulate complexity. The Ubaid figurines do not do this. They appear fully formed at the beginning of the Ubaid period with their complete reptilian morphology and maintain it without significant variation until the culture ends. If they were invented by the Ubaid people as symbolic imagery, the design appears to have arrived complete, as if copied from a pre-existing model rather than developed from imagination. The male figurines are shown in postures of authority, holding scepter-like objects in stances that directly anticipate the Sumerian depiction of divine kingship. The same posture, the same object, different face, and the Sumerian civilization that built directly on top of Ubaid foundations maintained in its earliest texts a theological tradition about beings called the Anunnaki, who came from the sky, lived among humans, and were responsible for the establishment of civilization, cities, agriculture, and law. The physical descriptions in some of the oldest Sumerian sources are not detailed, but the cultural memory is specific. The founders were not human in the way we are human. The mainstream interpretation is that Ubaid figurines represent a chthonic or underworld deity, possibly associated with water and fertility, explaining the reptilian features through the common ancient association of lizards and serpents with earth, water, and regeneration. The nursing figurines depict a fertility goddess, the body morphology serving as a sacred marker, distinguishing divine from human form. But fertility goddesses everywhere else in the ancient world are shown with exaggerated human anatomy, the breasts, the hips, the fullness of a body that produces life. The Ubaid figurines replace human anatomy with something structured and non-human. Top 8, the flying machine. From the flatlands of southern Iraq, we shift to a different kind of mystery. Not a figurine and not a monument, but a palm-sized carved wooden object pulled from an Egyptian tomb in 1898 and stored in a museum box for 70 years before anyone picked it up and noticed that it had something no bird has ever had, the flying machine in the tomb. In 1898, archaeologists cataloging the contents of a tomb at Saqqara, the great necropolis south of Cairo, removed a small wooden object from among the funerary goods and labeled it a wooden bird toy or model. It was assigned catalog number 6347 in the Cairo Museum's collection. It sat in a storage box for 70 years. Then, in 1969, an Egyptian physician and amateur aviation enthusiast named Khalil Messiha picked it up and noticed something that should not have been there: a vertical tail fin. Birds do not have vertical tail fins. Every bird that has ever existed stabilizes its flight with a horizontal tail and wing adjustments. A vertical stabilizer, a fin at 90 degrees to the wing plane, is a feature of fixed-wing aircraft. Without it, a plane cannot maintain directional control. With it, it can. The Saqqara bird has one, carved precisely at the correct angle, integrated into the tail of an object that otherwise looks like a stylized bird, but carries not a single carved feather anywhere on its surface. Messiha presented his findings to the Egyptian Ministry of Culture in 1969. A committee was assembled. A scaled replica was built and tested. It demonstrated measurable aerodynamic lift. Messiha published his analysis the same year, noting 5 specific features absent in all natural birds: the vertical tail fin, a flat bottom wing profile, tapered leading edges, upward wing dihedral, and a streamlined nose. These are not decorative choices. Each one is a functional aeronautical principle, and each one is present in the carving. The object measures 14.2 cm in length with a wingspan of 18 cm and weighs 39 to 12 grain, dimensions that produce a wing loading consistent with controlled gliding, rather than the decorative bird models that Egyptian craftsmen were producing in abundance during the same period. Those models have feathers. They have painted eyes. They are clearly birds. The Saqqara object has none of these features. Its surface is smooth. Its profile is aerodynamic. It has a vertical stabilizer that took humanity until the 19th century of the Common Era to independently invent. Aviation and aeronautical engineer Simon Sanderson built a further scaled-up replica for testing and confirmed that the design produces controlled lift and stable glide characteristics in controlled conditions. The dihedral angle of the wings, the upward tilt that provides roll stability, is precise. It does not arise from accidental shaping. It is either deliberate or an extraordinary coincidence in a culture that supposedly had no interest in the aerodynamic properties of carved wood. The mainstream Egyptological position classifies the Saqqara bird as a stylized votive offering in the form of a falcon, the bird sacred to Horus and Ra. The vertical fin is a tail feather rendered upright for structural reasons, to prevent the fragile tip from breaking off, or for aesthetic purposes, reflecting a particular carver's style. The smooth surface is explained by the absence of painted detail in this specific artifact. The aerodynamic properties are coincidental. There is no other evidence of flight technology in ancient Egypt. No workshop, no larger prototype, no instructional text, no visual depiction of a flying machine. But here is what the mainstream reading asks us to accept: that a craftsman making a votive falcon, a category of object produced in enormous quantities across all periods of Egyptian art, decided to render the tail feather vertically rather than horizontally, in a way that by accident introduced the single most critical control surface in fixed-wing aviation, and that the wings, which every other votive falcon shows rounded and feathered, were instead made flat-bottomed with a tapered leading edge and an upward dihedral angle, producing coincidentally the cross-section of a functioning glider wing. Every one of those features serves aerodynamic function and no decorative purpose. Top 9. The Barrier Canyon Giants. From a palm-sized wooden object in a museum box, we move to a scale that requires standing back to take in a canyon wall in the American desert. Figures carved into red stone at the height of a doorway, figures that are not quite human, and that multiple independent Native American oral traditions, with no knowledge of 20th century UFO mythology, describe in the same specific terms. The Barrier Canyon Giants, Thompson Springs, Utah. The canyon cuts north from the highway through striped red and cream sandstone walls. You have come to see the 3 layers of rock art that accumulate here, like geological strata. The most recent work nearest the eye, the oldest work deepest into the stone. The Ute people's horses and warriors occupy the top register. Below them, the Fremont culture's humpbacked figures with their distinctive headdresses, and beneath both, older than both, predating both cultures by thousands of years, a series of figures that nobody who sees them for the first time looks away from quickly. They stand between 1.5 and 2.5 men tall. Their bodies are trapezoidal, wider at the shoulders, narrowing toward where legs would be. There are no legs. The figures do not touch the ground. Their arms are vestigial, reduced to stubs, or absent entirely. Their heads are enormous relative to their bodies, elongated upward with large round eyes positioned at the front. There are no mouths. There are no noses. In several of the main figures, tubes or lines extend from the head region downward toward the body, or outward from the skull in positions that suggest antennae or breathing apparatus, or connections to something the carver considered important enough to include, but could not name in any form we recognize. Surrounding these figures in the same panels are images that are unmistakably human. Fremont period figures with clear faces, limbs, weapons, and clothing. The contrast is not subtle. The carver who produced the Barrier Canyon figures was not struggling with anatomy. They were depicting something different from a human and making certain the difference was visible. Archaeologist Polly Schaafsma's foundational study of Utah rock art, published through the University of Utah in 1971, identified the Barrier Canyon style as the oldest distinct artistic tradition in the region, with associated organic material producing radiocarbon dates placing it between 2000 and 4000 BCE. While stylistic analysis by other researchers has suggested selected figures may date to 8000 or 9000 BCE, more than 250 Barrier Canyon-style sites have been identified across the Colorado Plateau, making it one of the most geographically widespread prehistoric art styles in North America. This distribution is itself unusual. Shamanic art traditions tend to be local, rooted in specific geographic and spiritual relationships. They vary significantly from site to site because the visions that generate them are personal and culturally specific. The Barrier Canyon style does not vary significantly. The same sealed trapezoidal body, the same large head, the same absence of lower limbs, the same forward-facing eyes, appears across 250 sites spanning an enormous geographic range, with a geometric consistency that looks less like independent artistic expression and more like a distributed record of a specific observed form. Anthropologist Sally Cole's analysis and legacy on stone documented that multiple southwestern Native American groups, including the Hopi, preserve oral traditions describing non-human sky beings whose visual description corresponds to the Barrier Canyon figures. These traditions predate any contact with 20th century popular culture about extraterrestrials. The Hopi Kachina tradition, which describes spiritual intermediaries who came from beyond the sky, predates Columbus by centuries in its earliest documented forms. The standard archaeological reading classifies Barrier Canyon figures as shamanic spirit beings, representations of entities encountered in trance states induced by fasting, sensory deprivation, or plant-based ritual practice. The floating posture reflects the weightlessness of trance. The large heads and eyes indicate expanded spiritual perception. The tubes or antennae are power lines or energy flows common in shamanic visual vocabulary. But shamanic trance art in the traditions where it is best documented shows recognizable humans in states of dissolution and transformation. The Barrier Canyon figures do not show humans losing their form. They show a form that never had a human baseline to begin with. Top 10. The Helicopter Hieroglyphs. From the Utah canyons, we make one final crossing back to Egypt, to the most sacred temple in one of the most sacred cities of the ancient world, to a carved stone beam above a doorway that British explorers noticed in 1848 and did not write about in detail for decades. And when photographs finally circulated a century and a half later, the world understood why they hesitated. The helicopter hieroglyphs. The temple of Seti I at Abydos is not a minor site. Abydos was among the oldest cities in ancient Egypt, the burial ground of the earliest pharaohs, a place of pilgrimage for 3,000 years, and the location of the Abydos king list. One of the most carefully verified chronological records of Egyptian royal history carved on the walls of this exact building. When the ancient Egyptians decided where to keep their most important historical record, they kept it here. The temple was begun under Seti I around 1290 BCE and modified by his son, Ramesses II. It is among the best preserved temples in Egypt, with original paint still visible in its inner chambers. In its outer hypostyle hall, above a doorway, in the position of maximum visibility that Egyptian sacred architecture reserved for its most significant inscriptions, there is a carved stone beam. And carved into that beam is a sequence of hieroglyphs that, when photographed and circulated in the late 1990s, stopped people cold around the world. Viewed without prior Egyptological framing, the sequence shows four distinct forms. The first has a flat horizontal base, a rounded cockpit-like protrusion above it, and a disc-shaped rotor above that. It looks like a helicopter. The second is elongated and cylindrical with a raised conning tower profile. It looks like a submarine. The third has a forward-swept wing configuration in a streamlined body. It looks like a fixed-wing aircraft. The fourth is disc-shaped and hovering. The images appear on a single beam in sequence in one of the holiest buildings in the ancient world. The Egyptological consensus explanation is called the palimpsest theory, and it is coherent and worth understanding properly. The Temple of Seti I underwent modifications under Ramesses II, during which certain inscriptions were partially plastered over and recarved with new texts. Where that plaster has deteriorated over 3,000 years, the boundary between the original Seti I carving and the Ramesses II overlay becomes visible, and the two overlapping layers of hieroglyphs produce composite shapes. The individual hieroglyphs from each layer are identifiable. Their boundaries merge in ways that create the visual impression of coherent objects. You see a helicopter because you know what a helicopter looks like, and the composite shape is close enough to trigger recognition. An ancient Egyptian looking at the same carving would see two incomplete sets of meaningful religious symbols. Not a vehicle. This explanation should be taken seriously. It is based on how hieroglyphic carving actually worked, and the practice of plastering and recarving inscriptions is thoroughly documented across Egyptian temples. The people who built this explanation are serious scholars who have spent careers at these sites. But the palimpsest theory has a gap that has never been formally closed. For the explanation to account for all four vehicle shapes in sequence, four separate accidental overlaps in the same beam must each, independently, produce the silhouette of a different modern transportation technology. The probability of that occurring by chance has not been calculated and published. The explanation is invoked as sufficient without the underlying mathematics being demonstrated. We accept the coincidence because it is more comfortable than the alternative. But accepting an unexplained coincidence is not the same as explaining it. And there is something else. The beam sits above a doorway in a temple whose walls also hold the most carefully maintained royal chronological record in Egyptian history. The Abydos king list does not contain symbolic or mythological content. It is a specific, verified, historically accurate sequence of 76 pharaohs. A document created with the explicit intention of preserving precise information across time. The people who built this temple were capable of encoding and protecting exact knowledge in permanent stone form. They did it on the wall right next to the beam in question. If the overlapping carvings are accidental, they are a coincidence embedded in a building built by people who did not leave things to chance. If they are intentional, the intent was specific enough to position four identifiable forms in sequence above a doorway in the most visited part of the most important temple in the most significant city of the ancient world. Some researchers have suggested the palimpsest is real, but was used deliberately, that the overlapping layers were engineered to encode imagery that could only be read by someone who already knew what to look for, a message in plain sight, legible only from the future. Whether that interpretation is credible or not, it raises a question that the standard explanation has not fully answered. Why, of all the places where Ramesses II replastered and recarved inscriptions across all his building projects, did this particular overlap in this particular location, in this particular temple, produce something that looks so exactly like a sequence of modern vehicles? We may never know with certainty what the ancient carver intended, but the carving is there. The beam is real, the photographs are real, and the question it asks is 3,000 years old and still open. 10 carvings, 12,000 years of human history, 5 continents, and in every case the same structure. Something carved into the most durable medium available in a position of maximum permanence by cultures that understood the difference between decoration and record. What connects all 10 is not the mainstream explanation for any individual item. The mainstream explanations are often coherent, sometimes compelling, and always worth knowing. What connects them is the gap that remains after each explanation is applied. The place where the official answer stops fitting and the question is still there, carved into the stone, waiting. The honest position, and the position that takes both the evidence and the scholars seriously, is this. We do not know what the Jomans saw when they built the goggle-eyed dog. We do not know what the Saharan artists encountered when they climbed scaffolding to paint a 6-meter featureless figure in a green world that was beginning to die. We do not know what knowledge the builders of Göbekli Tepe were encoding or why they buried it. We do not know what the Aboriginal elders mean at the deepest level when they say the Wandjina came from the sky. We do not know what Seti's carvers put above that doorway and why. What we know is that they went to extraordinary lengths to put it somewhere permanent, and they did it across every inhabited continent, across 10,000 years, with a consistency that convergent invention does not cleanly account for. History is not a straight line. It is more like a palimpsest. Layer upon layer, what we can read depends on where the plaster has crumbled and what we are willing to see underneath. Most people walk through these sites and read what the guidebook hands them. You are not most people. You got here, which means you look for the places where the explanation stops fitting. That instinct is not fringe thinking. It is the oldest scientific impulse there is. The refusal to stop at a comfortable answer when the evidence is still talking. This channel exists for that refusal, not to sell you a theory, to dig up a better question. If these ancient mysteries have changed the way you look at the history of our world, please subscribe and like the video. We are unearthing the history that they have tried to bury. Plant the seeds of the future. The next archive will be open soon. Go to the comments and make the case for the one carving on this list where you think the mainstream explanation fails most completely. Identify the exact gap. Be specific. Defend it. Let's find out who can build the strongest argument. The floor is yours. Stone is the oldest library. It does not burn, it does not rot, and it does not misremember. Every civilization that has ever collapsed left its most important message in the hardest surface it could reach. Not because the carvers expected to be immediately understood, but because they refused to let what they knew disappear entirely. The people who cut these 10 images into the rock were not trying to mystify us. They were trying to reach us. 12,000 years later, we are finally close enough to hear what they said. Subscribe and stay close. The question is still open and the walls are still talking.